All right, third lecture. Sorry about the mess up yesterday. There's some issue with putting the screen up and me talking. So hopefully I got it all corrected. And I've also found out from my world history kids that a lot of these videos are not working the first time you download them. So you'll probably see this in YouTube, and that's where I'm going to be going forward. All the videos we posted to YouTube and then placed in your classroom. So the lecture today is 1960s culture and counterculture. With that, what we're going to do is I'll do the quiz and I'll read the questions and then give you the answer. And you feel free to stop me at any time and just answer yourself if you want, so that you can kind of get some feedback as you check in. Speaking on that idea, Friday, I was going to give you an online quiz. Sounds like the state is not moving that direction. So it'll just be a check-in, see how well you do. I will not be scoring it in gradebook, but that's the plan. All right, so here we go. Going back to the start. Here's your quiz. I'll read over the questions, then give you an answer. Feel free to stop at any time. All right, what was LBJ's political affiliation? The answer is obviously he was a Democrat. 2, why was LBJ being a Protestant important to the presidential push for JFK? Being a Protestant was important because JFK was Catholic, and a lot of American voters in the 1960s were worried about a Catholic president. So to have a Protestant Christian would balance out a lot of fears on the Democratic ticket. 3, why did the federal tax cuts decrease from $6 billion to $4 billion from 1960 to 64? And the decrease were tax cuts across the board for the rich, middle class, and poor. People have more money in their pockets, and more money in the pockets they spent, and the money then trickled back to the government. So it was a interesting and unique way to get money back in the federal government's pocket by actually cutting taxes. 4, name of the LBJ's plan to make the U.S. the greatest country in the free world. That's the Great Society, and there's 2 parts to that. All right. 5, names 3 specific programs and or areas that receive federal funding as part of the LBJ's presidency. 1 is going to be the waterways, protecting our natural waterways. 2 would be an easy option of increasing school funding. And then 3, housing, urban housing specifically. But with that, that was one of the failure areas. 6, what impact did the war in court have on 2 traditions within schools? 1 is the banning of school prayer. And then within school, they, for a while, banned the Lord's Prayer. All right. Pledge of Allegiance, it's fine, but they banned an endorsement of religion. 7, in order to wage a war on poverty, what specifically did LBJ focus on funding or helping? I'm just going to close this out. Sorry, I lost my train of thought here. Oh, the war on poverty. He's going to funnel money to children. Eventually starting with children and textbooks, and like $1 billion spent when he first launches a program. And then it's going to go to getting kids skills and trades. So focusing on trades and making them job ready, like a Head Start program. 8, what is a major criticism of LBJ's Great Society by Republicans? 1, it costs way too much money. And 2, the criticism is probably the housing scenario that turned out to be disastrous. So it's very expensive, and also some of it didn't work, specifically urban housing in large cities. All right. So topic today, 1960s culture and 1960s counterculture. I don't know what happened there. All right. So the counterculture movement. When we say counterculture, it runs everything against traditional culture. This is the different way of going through life, and it manifests really in the 60s. So it's at the time in the 60s, mostly white middle class youth. So they're highly educated, but these are the kids who are really, they don't like the Vietnam War. They view it as a negative, that they don't want to be involved in it. It's someone else's war. So they're mostly white. They're well educated. They're college kids, and they're, for the most part, disillusioned with the Vietnam War. Another theme you also find in the 60s is rejection of material wealth. They didn't want the 9-to-5 jobs with a pension, 2 kids. They don't want that. They think life is deeper than just what you own and what you buy. So they want a society based on peace and love. If you listen to anything like the Beatles, there's a lot of themes of the Beatles in the 1960s going along with this idea of free love, rejecting material possessions. There's more to life than that, and a society built on peace and love, not war, which is experienced in the 1960s. One thing you also find in the 60s, you got you got the hippies, colorful, bright, energetic patterns, and the style is, there's nothing like it. People, it's weird now because the fashion industry has kind of adapted a lot of these fashions of the hippies, and it's become mainstream right now in 2020. Some more pictures of hippies. I mean, just doing some really radical, out there, wild styles. Longer hair for the men. Women were burning bras in the 60s. So this is just, it's a totally different style in the 60s. So one of the informal leaders in the 1960s is this guy named Timothy Leary. You see on the top there, turn on, tune in, and drop out. It's got an interesting backstory, so we'll start to unpack that one. So the counterculture movement really in the 60s are the hippies. They go against the mainstream, they go against the main flow of traditional society. And their informal leader is this guy named Timothy Leary. He's a Harvard professor. And a lot of experiments he used from a psychological perspective, his colleagues had questions with them for obvious reasons. One of the things he was oftentimes encouraging people to do was to have used different types of LSD and mushrooms, and he was looking at the psychological impact of the human mind on drugs. Obviously, there's some ethical issues here with who's partaking, the legal issues of using drugs. So his methods were rather questionable, but that was Timothy Leary. So it said, yeah, experience with LSD and mushrooms. Weirdly, mushrooms were not legal at the time. They ended up put onto a level 1 type of drug. So he was using them, and then eventually they go and become illegal. And then he continued to use mushrooms and LSD on his students for experiments. His Harvard colleagues did not condone the methods. A lot of the stuff they found out that he does publish is not accepted in the psychological community for obvious reasons, because of ethical reasons. But he really starts to push the youth. That's his target. That's what he's really trying to appeal to. A whole generation to leave their traditional school, to leave their work, to leave everything, and to work collectively on a farm. Everyone would have a job and a role in a society based on you would do everything. Like you'd work, someone else have a job. It sounds a lot like communism, but they called these things communes. These areas where these people would meet, and they're rejecting everyday society, and they were just going to try to live off the farm, live off the land, and probably do a vast amount of illegal drugs as well. So that was the hippie movement of the 60s. All right. So here's some early pictures you see of Timothy Leary, LSD. I mean, so it's pretty wild. His picture over time, because of his drug abuse, he ages rather quickly. That's him later on by the late 60s, early 70s, and his drug use and abuse also catches up with him. He'll be arrested several times for trafficking drugs across state lines. Here are the pictures of these things called communes that the hippies were trying in the 1960s. Peace, love, they live off the land. Every person would have a role. Music was big. The drugs were pretty rampant. And one thing they start to find in these communes is there's a lot of children who are born. They're born into these communes. And I don't think they really plan for that next phase of child rearing in these communes. So once again, just more pictures of this 60s counterculture movement, the hippies of the 60s. Right. Peace, love. It seems almost idyllic. Over time, it's really going to have some challenges as we'll look at in a bit. But it starts out as this movement against society. Right. Farming, raising chickens. Pretty wild. Speaking of communes, there's this guy here. This is Charles Manson. Manson wanted to make it into the music industry. He recruits a bunch of people to also live in these communes in California. He's able to convince a lot of ranchers and herders to give him land. And this is where his cult starts. He starts to appeal to the women. You can do a lot of research yourself into Manson, but eventually Manson will become a murderer. He doesn't get his contract. He goes after several prominent people in the record and recording industry and has them murdered because he did not get the contract. He also thought there was going to be a war between whites and blacks. And remember, this is the 60s where there's a lot of racial tension. And he thought he could start a revolution. The song Helter Skelter by the Beatles, he thought the Beatles were actually singing that to him as a way to start a race war. Some pretty wild stuff. Here's the murder of the scene of the individual. Him and his he got women to go in and to murder this man who was linked up as a major producer in the recording industry of California. So that's one example of a commune gone wrong. So let's get back to hippie culture. The big prominent themes: rock and roll is huge in the 1960s. You probably heard a lot of those classic rock artists, but I mean, it is huge for its time. Outrageous clothing, the more colorful, the more new, the more edgy, that was embraced. Free love, the sex in the 60s was something that people were experimenting with, not exactly knowing the ramifications of the choices there, but free love is pretty rampant in the 60s. The use of drugs. A lot of the drugs were coming in from Vietnam, so the soldiers in Vietnam were introduced to marijuana. It got them hooked, and it was brought back to the United States. It started to be shipped in as well, once the soldiers who returned. But up to that point, marijuana was just mostly found amongst musicians, writers, as kind of a fringe drug until it becomes mainstream from the Vietnam War, from the soldiers who bring it back. And they also doing more aggressive drugs, LSD, USC shrooms as well. So the drug use in the 60s is pretty rampant. One thing you find also is kind of a rejection of Christianity, if you will. That was traditional culture. And what you see in the 60s is a movement towards Zen Buddhism, which was prominent amongst the Beatles, and they really start to push their religious views and the audience that listens to them. So Buddhism becomes pretty popular in the 60s as well. And you start to see the idea of this community again, these not exactly communes where people live and farms, but shared housing. Since you're not working a traditional job, you had to pull your resources for rent. And one of the areas that starts to emerge is Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco. You can still visit it today. It's known for its tribute to 1960s culture and counterculture. And one of the reasons that brought people to Haight-Ashbury, there was no ban on illegal drugs until 1966. It was a local community. There was no ban on it, so people were drawn to their ability to engage in any kind of drug use they wanted. Even the Beatles, in this don't look at it too long, but they say LSD is Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds is a praise to the drug LSD. So I will change off that before I lose my mind on that slide. All right. Yeah. And just once again, that's wild images of the 60s. All right. Paisley. Yeah. Crazy designs. It's like some of Mr. Klinger's ties look like that. All right. Here are some major artists of the 60s. You got Jimi Hendrix. Hendrix is a legend for a lot of reasons because he was left-handed, and most guitars were built for people with the right hand who were right-handed. So he flipped the guitar upside down and learned to play guitar that way. I mean, that's just absolutely wild what Jimi Hendrix was able to do. All right. And we're moving and transitioning once again towards more of the music now, and we'll eventually get to Woodstock, but just a wild. Yeah. Acid for $1 in 1962. For fun, a few years ago, my students did an inflation calculator. It's like $8.52 in 2019 for acid. So, I mean, availability, pretty wild. But the long-term effect, I mean, it seems like it's a fun, free-loving time, but there are going to be ramifications for this free-loving lifestyle, specifically the drug fall and addiction. So here's one: drop acid, not bombs. It's the 60s. It's historical. All right. So more 60s. All right. So this is Haight-Ashbury pictures from today. You can still see the themes of the 60s around. All right. Some of the famous shops. Pretty wild. All right. Some more pictures. And the weird thing about Haight-Ashbury too is it's not that far away from this iconic scene where you have Full House. Remember that one from the 80s? Now Fuller House, that reboot. It's in that general area. So go figure. Go figure. All right. So the fallout. I mean, free love and drugs eventually catches up with you. So we'll take a look at the fallout here. A quote: "We fell apart over who would cook and wash dishes and pay bills." And what they're referencing there is the commune life. They start having children there. There's a breakdown in terms of how you make ends meet, who does the dishes. And the biggest thing is probably the systemic abuse and misuse of drugs and addictive drugs of the 60s. So by the 70s, many fall victim to drug abuse and addiction. This is a public health issue at this point. If you take the drug abuse and misuse and couple that with any kind of mental issues with the people, any kind of predisposed conditions to depression, it's a bad recipe. You've also got people on welfare. I mean, they are rock bottoming out. They're either dying, overdosing, or they can't work a traditional job to make ends meet. So welfare becomes rampant in those areas. And of course, homelessness too by the 70s. And some of the major lead iconic singers of the 70s also die of drug overdose. Janis Joplin sings the song Me and Bobby McGee. Lord, Won't You Buy Me a Mercedes Benz? You've heard those songs. She overdosed in the 70s. Jimi Hendrix, a rock god. Anyone's like, if you look at 60s music, amazing, but also dies in the 70s as well. So if you get a chance, look up some Hendrix songs or Janis Joplin. Well worth your time. You have plenty of time too over this break. So now look at the art real quick. One thing you start to see is changing culture of art. Andy Warhol is perhaps the most iconic artist of the 1960s. And what he did, he looked at the mass-produced art and just mass-produced society of the 50s and 60s, and he found symmetry with it. You've probably seen this Campbell's soup. He took this and it became huge art. The value is almost priceless. If you have some Warhol sitting around somewhere, it's worth a lot of money. But he's taking on themes like the loss of personal freedom, the cookie cutter lifestyle. He's taking that, and this is his early work. And here's the next one. Here's Marilyn Monroe, and he took this, and it's once again, it's this repetition, but then you add these wild colors on top of it. Perhaps influenced by the drug use of the 1960s and the vivid colors of the hippies themselves. But that's what he's doing for art. Okay, here's John Lennon. Once again, it's just the idea. You see the same exact picture, but it's done with different colors and tones. And this becomes Warhol's work. Rock music of the 60s, the icons of this, the Beatles, the Grateful Dead, the Deadheads out there, the Rolling Stones, one of my favorites. You get a chance to look them up. Joe Cocker, not my cup of tea, but he's big in the 60s. If you want to Google some Joe Cocker stuff, good luck. Have fun with that. And then the big thing it really culminates with is Woodstock. 1968, terrible year if you remember it. The Tet Offensive is happening. America's losing its grip in 68. King is assassinated in 68. All these bad things are happening in 68. And this is the summer of 1969. A lot of people reference this as this unique summer, probably never to be replicated. So Woodstock is a art fair. It's mostly music, but it's also art fair in New York. And the promoters, they're able to convince, it was supposed to be in a town, the town basically shut it down. They moved to the small town of Woodstock, and they had 400,000 people show up to hear the major artists of their time. They first charge admission, and it was a decent price for its time. I want to say like the equivalent is like $50, $60 a ticket, but more people started showing up than never sold tickets for. And it became a issue of basic sanitation. We have 400,000 people who are camping out, doing drugs, not bringing all the food they need, or having proper toilets. It got nasty. And then luckily it rained one of those days. All right. So here's the actual Woodstock 50. Yeah, it was supposed to happen in 2019. It got canceled. Yeah, that one didn't happen. So Woodstock, all of these people showed up to an event that was way bigger than they expected. They were there for the music, the free love, and some of the drugs that go along with the music experience. As weird as it was, there aren't too many records of violence or arrests. I'm sure there's probably some booking for drug use and abuse, but there's not too many records of violence breaking out between the different people, despite having 400,000 people without decent sanitation and food. You see some pictures here. This is the hill, and if you get all the way down stage, you'd see the stage where these rock gods of the 60s showed up. All right. So one last thing about that, I saw a documentary one time, and they said that the local town, the women of the local town came together and they made sandwiches on a massive scale for these people, and they fed these young people. I'm like, that is unreal. It's a small little town, pool of resources to the young people who are coming in there. And the interesting spot about Woodstock was on one of the days, luckily, it started to rain. So you have all of these mud pits where people were like engaging in fun and wrestling, whatever. But they were able to go down to the river, and they were able to use a lot of the water to bathe themselves after several days. So that was a blessing in disguise. All right. So all of this goes back to these changing attitudes in the 1960s. There's a sexual revolution out there. TV, books, magazines, music. Movies began to address the subject for the first time ever in the 60s. Up until this point on television, sex was never talked about. You oftentimes saw a couple in separate beds if there was ever like a bedroom scene in 1950s or 60s television. You didn't see it. It was shocking. It was shocking in the 60s when couples were actually in the same bed together. Some people found it liberating, and others really saw it as a sign of moral decay, like a society had lost itself and had given into like the live now moment. So there's two sides, one that engaged and one had wanted nothing to do with it. And then just the way it's different. It's culture versus counterculture. The dress, appearance, lifestyle, the social behaviors. It was pretty shocking to most traditional Americans, and they had found a way to like almost counter the counterculture. And that leads us really to the conservative response there. So Nixon, who's the president of the United States, and J. Edgar Hoover, who's in charge of the FBI, saw this change as revolutionary terrorism. It upset the American psyche of the 9-to-5 job or traditional life based in traditional American conservative values. They saw this as a revolution, very similar almost to communism, so it was a way to attack it. So counterculture is perceived to be doing well at colleges and large cities. So you tend to see this movement criticizing universities for more liberal ideas. And also, if you remember back to the 1920s and 1930s, there's a difference between city life and rural life. City life much more liberal and progressive, rural life much more conservative and traditional. And there's this gap is really expanded and heightened by the conservatives in the 1960s. So a quote here by a psychiatrist: members of the counterculture have been pampered in childhood. As young adults, they did not have the ability for delayed gratification. And that's what most conservatives were saying, psychologists were saying. It was the live now moment versus conservatism is a way to delay gratification. You're able to resist your urges. And that's what conservatives were saying. This group had clearly missed. They were spoiled. They were rotten. So a way to possibly capitalize on this politically, you capitalize on the lawlessness, the crime, the growth of the federal government under LBJ. The government gotten very large, and conservatives rallied against this because this is more taxes going out of their back pocket. And the welfare, the 1960s, the fall of drug culture. Most Americans didn't like the idea of their money being taken from them to deal with the social issues of a generation who had engaged in rampant drug use and misuse. So these became major talking points for Nixon's and conservatives, not only for the 1960s. I mean, if you look at these ideas here, these are definitely ideas conservatives still hold to today in the 2020. And that ends our 60s. All right. I encourage you to go back, take a look at previous lectures. I'm thinking of doing perhaps maybe next week some kind of video conference. If you have questions, you could ask me directly. But if you want to send me an email, I have nothing else to do besides raise my children and answer your emails right now. So if you want to do that, you may definitely feel free to do that as well. All right, 1 week down. I will see you when I see you. You've got a check-in quiz Friday. Do it. I'm not going to score it. Just check yourself to see how well you're doing. You will have a final exam eventually, so just make sure you feel like you're understanding the content. I'll post this and the actual notes, hard copy of the notes to follow along in case you want as well. All right, until next time.